Let's take a journey through the Form 1040. And the Form 1040 is the individual income tax return. And I think it's really important to understand the construction of Form 1040 so that we can observe different items and, maybe even come up with some great tax planning strategies. So, up at the top starts off fairly benign with the information of the taxpayer, the spouse's information if the taxpayer is married. And obviously, social security numbers, got to have those listed on there. And then I get down to filing status. And it says check only one box. And we see these different statuses. And one of the biggest misconceptions that I find in tax is applying these very general, colloquial definitions to any of these items listed here. In tax, one of the things that we have to do is say, well, what do you mean by? What's the definition of? What's the definition of single? What's the definition of head of household? What's the difference between the two? And what's interesting is in order to answer the question about filing status, we actually need to skip a couple of boxes and go down to dependents. And if we answer dependents first, then we should work our way back up to filing status so that we can select the proper filing status. Now, in between, we've skipped digital assets, and we can talk about that question and whether or not we would list yes or no. And then for standard deduction and understanding standard versus itemized, we'll discuss in more detail as well. We want to understand, well, can someone claim you as a dependent? Have you reached a certain age? Or are you blind? Because if you have reached a certain age or you're blind, you are entitled to an additional standard deduction as a result. So let's skip a couple of rows and go down to dependents and see if we can answer dependents first, and let's better understand the definition of dependents. When we're trying to figure out dependents, we need to determine who qualifies as a taxpayer's dependent. And again, we're going to skip a couple of boxes to go down to dependents before we can really answer filing status. Dependents have significant impact on tax returns because it's going to impact certain things like the child tax credit or the American Opportunity Tax Credit, or what do I pick up for my medical expenses if we're doing itemized medical expenses, and from whom. So when we think about dependents, again, one of the biggest misconceptions that I tend to see in practice is applying these really general colloquial understanding of terms to a situation. And yes, sometimes dependents are just painfully obvious. It's, well, this is my son and daughter, and clearly they are, 11 and 6. They're dependents, right? 99.9 times out of 100, they're going to end up just being straight-laced dependents. But life has a funny way of throwing us some curveballs. And I've seen all sorts of different types of dependent situations that don't fall under that plain vanilla. So let's talk about dependents in a broader spectrum. The first requirement of being a dependent is that individual that's potentially being claimed as a dependent must be a citizen of the United States or a resident of the United States, Canada, or Mexico. That's really important, right? Because this can't be somebody that is not in the US, Canada, or Mexico. Perhaps somebody immigrated from Europe. This wouldn't necessarily apply to them. The second thing that we must absolutely check before we go into two different buckets of dependents is that the person that we are trying to claim must not file a joint return with their spouse. Now, that's really seems like an oddity, right? Like, why would I not file with my spouse? And if they're that old and they're married, why would I still be able to claim them? Well, I'll tell you, it's kind of interesting. I've come across some clients that their son or daughter got married relatively young, right? And maybe they were 18 and they were still in college and fell madly in love, or they went into the military and decided to get married. There's a lot of situations that you'll see in practice that could potentially happen, where maybe the daughter got married at 18 or 19 and she's still in college or going to college, still really a dependent, but if they're filing a joint return with their spouse, you may not claim them as a dependent. So that's really important for us to understand as well when we're considering, well, who do I claim as a dependent on my tax return? Once we get to this juncture, we have to make a decision of, is this person a qualifying child or are they a qualifying relative? So for a qualifying child, there are 4 tests that we need to meet. The first test is the qualifying child is the relationship test. And this relationship test starts off, again, pretty plain vanilla that we would expect a normal kind of child to fall under the definition of taxpayer's son or daughter or maybe stepchild. But then we start to expand quite a bit. We have eligible foster children that could potentially be picked up here. It could be, as a qualifying child, your brother, your sister, your half-brother, half-sister, stepbrother, stepsister, or any descendant of these relatives. The way I like to think about the qualifying child relationship test is out and down. Can't go up, but it can go out and down. So descendants of any of these relatives would be, for example, my sister's children, right? My nephews could potentially be a qualifying child in the correct situation. So we have to meet the relationship test. By the way, in these 4 tests, we have to meet all 4 of these. The next test in qualifying child is the age test. And this one, again, kind of falls in line with the out and down mentality, in that the qualifying child must be younger than the individual claiming the child as a qualifying child, and either. So, gotta be younger, and either one of these. 1, you're under the age of 19 at the end of the year. 2, you are under 24 at the end of the year and a full-time student. Or, option 3, you're permanently and totally disabled. So again, younger than the individual claiming the child as a qualifying child, and then one of those 3 criteria. So if we go back and think about the relationship test, my sister could not be my qualifying child because she is older than I am. The next test is the residence test. And in the residence test, you must be in the same residence as your potential dependent for more than half the year. So taxpayer and dependent must be in the same residence for more than half the year. What's more than half the year? More than half the year. Not half exactly, more than half. At least 1 day more in order to be more than half the year. Now, there are some exceptions to that. The exception would be for temporary absences, such as a dependent child going off to college where they live in the dorm, but their intention is to come back home during the summer months or during holidays, right, when school is not in session. That's the residence test. Then finally, we have the support test. And the support test looks at it from the perspective of the child. And we have to ask the question, does the child provide more than half of his or her own support? So what exactly is support? Well, scholarships are excluded from support computation only if it is the actual child of the taxpayer. If it's a grandchild, that would not be the case. All right, so this is really important what the perspective is, right? Because we have to look at it from, is the child providing more than half of their own support? It doesn't matter if the taxpayer is actually doing it. It only looks at it from the perspective of the qualifying child. Now, there are many reasons why we might have to evaluate a situation where we would apply some tie-breaking rules. So, for example, if going through the 4 tests, and we'll look at an example to see how this could potentially happen. If we go through those 4 tests and a non-parent actually meets all of those tests, the parent would always be able to claim the child for dependent purposes before a non-parent. Now, what if both parents are eligible? The tiebreaker is then based on the parent with whom the child resided with the most during the year. We sometimes refer to that as the custodial parent. Now, that ends up being exactly the same. The parent with the higher adjusted gross income would be able to claim the child as a dependent, and that's kind of nice because that is where the value would be most for the person and save potentially the most taxes as a result. If everyone is a non-parent in the situation, then the highest AGI then is also the tiebreaker rule that gets applied. So now let's talk about qualifying relative. If we're not a qualifying child, perhaps we meet the criteria as qualifying relative. Qualifying relative is a little bit shorter of a runway because it only has 3 tests. The first is the relationship test. And under the relationship test, you can see those options listed here, and you think to myself, my goodness, this is like anybody. In fact, look at the last bullet. It's anyone with no qualifying family relationship that's listed above, as long as they live in the taxpayer's home for the entire year, which is kind of wild, right? So this could really be anybody. What I do find interesting under the qualifying family relationship, if you look at the third bullet and it says a son or daughter of the taxpayer's brother or sister, not your cousin. So they can't be your cousin, which is really kind of interesting. So cousins get carved out from a family relationship perspective, but we might get there under the other person as long as that person lives in the taxpayer's home for the entire year. Now that's distinctly different than qualifying child, which said, it's just got to be more than half the year. This is entire year, 365 or 366 days if it's a leap year. So there's the relationships test, which is pretty broad as a result. Next, we have the support test. And the support test under qualifying child looked at it from the perspective of the child. The support test for qualifying relative, however, looks at it from the perspective of the taxpayer and asks the question, does the taxpayer pay more than half of the living expenses, the support for the potential qualifying relative? So it has to look at it from the taxpayer's perspective, not the potential dependent. Now you'll notice again, the scholarships of an actual child are excluded, but in a little bit different perspective that we have from the qualifying child does not have a gross income test, but the qualifying relative does. And in order to be a qualifying relative, the potential dependent, their gross income must be less than $5,050 in 2024, and that number gets adjusted for inflation every year.